Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for EEA's Education Series webinar. Today, we will discuss best practices for managing private keys within the enterprise and other organizations. Today's call is being recorded and will be available to all attendees and the public on the EEA YouTube channel soon after today's presentation. The Enterprise Ethereum Alliance enables organizations to adopt and use Ethereum technology in their daily business operations. The EEA empowers the Ethereum ecosystem to develop new business opportunities, drive industry adoption, and learn and collaborate with one another. We welcome any and everyone to join and become a part of our global community. At this time, we are pleased to introduce one of our speakers, Conor Svensson.
Oh, thanks, Brittany. Hey everyone, I'm Conor Svensson. I'm the founder and CEO of Web3 Labs. I've been very involved in the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance for a number of years. I was responsible working with the technical specification group to create the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance client specification. We ran a EEA meetup for a while, and we've been, I guess, engrossed within Web3 since 2017. Early on, we was involved in Quorum, wrote the Web3J library, and now we do a lot of strategy work with corporates as well as delivery, which some of the knowledge of which we've gained will factor into what we discuss here today. We also have a proprietary block explorer too called eea-eth. It's really cool that we've been able to get Johann here as well, because to hear what MetaMask Institutional are up to is you know, I think there is no better voice really to represent the kind of the enterprise space. So Johann, would you like to introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about what you do at MetaMask?
Yeah, thank you, Conor, and good morning all. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Johann Bornman. I am the product lead for MetaMask Institutional. We are an institutional platform that offers, we would say, unrivaled access to Web3. We do so with the most trusted wallet in the space, MetaMask, that has more than 30 million monthly active users. And then on top of that, we've built a range of capabilities to cater to institutional needs. Most importantly, which I think is very apt for this discussion, we sort of built an API and SDK layer that allows us to connect into custodians. So today we work with qualified custodians, custody tech providers, licensed custodians, and digital asset management platforms like ConsenSys to cater to different institutions that have different needs as they think about key management, storage, and signing. And then on top of that, we have a range of additional features in terms of portfolio monitoring, reporting, and risk assessments on DeFi pools. So just thinking very deeply about the typical transaction flow that organizations have to go through. Like how do they decide to allocate into Web3 and all the various different steps around that, and sort of building products and services in that space.
Thanks, Johann. So we want to make today's session interactive. We've got various questions and topics that between us we're going to be discussing, but also if anyone listening has specific questions they want to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat. We will be keeping an eye on them and making sure that we respond to all of them, because it's an education session after all, right? We want to ensure that everyone comes away with a lot of really helpful learnings and their eyes are really open to everything that's going on within the sort of institutional wallet space, so to speak. But I'd like to steer the conversation, first of all, with, I guess, what is probably, in some levels, a kind of obvious question to some, but maybe not such an obvious question to others. But what are the fundamental differences in an institution's needs with a product like MetaMask versus just using the default one that people use in their browser or on their phone?
Yeah, great first question. So I think a lot of this sort of comes around, firstly, personal choice, and then potentially the freedom that individuals have over organizations. And that sort of normally coalesces around, how do we as individuals decide to store our keys? Now, for most of us that are familiar with the MetaMask wallet, that will either sort of be done with the key store in the browser, as you've referenced, Conor, or potentially using a hardware wallet as a layer in terms of the key storing and signing process. Now that works very well. We might have obviously very strong decentralized values and roots as well that we prefer to custody-owned assets. And so these are the sort of frameworks and thinking that will drive our decision in terms of how we think about custody versus non-custodial. When you're an organization, though, you obviously face a different set of challenges. And some of this is driven by the regulatory framework that you have to operate within. Some of it will be driven by your operational infrastructure. And some of it will be driven by sort of how you think about risk management generally. And maybe sort of the simple example to use here is that if you and I had to start a crypto fund and we're both based in London, it'd be very easy for us to potentially pass ledger wallets or hardware wallets between ourselves within London. But if we had to hire a third person, a fourth person, we'd obviously give complete trust to those individuals to have complete power to send assets anywhere on the network. And this is where, when you're thinking about custodian solutions, and I know we're going to be exploring this topic far deeper, the aspect of having to work with different custody infrastructure, having to think about multi-sig or MMN signing, as it's referenced in other forms of key management, thinking very deeply about kind of allow listing of smart contract calls, allow listing of tokens, and then very importantly, in some regulatory jurisdictions, also having to work with licensed custodians. And so again, I started giving an answer around freedom. I think as individuals, we probably have a little bit more freedom in terms of the regulatory oversight we face. But when it comes to organizations, they absolutely have to do key management in very particular ways.
I think it's definitely a good thing to jump into actually around the key management side, because whilst cryptocurrencies themselves are and Web3 applications and the associated infrastructure are kind of something that's new, the whole thing of it being of key management within enterprises is a very well understood topic. It's something that's been in place for years and years, and within any large corporate, for instance, they have these hardware security modules, or HSMs, that Johann mentioned there, which are in effect special tamper-proof infrastructure where you can store these, and they have whole processes around it. And these keys would be used for things like when you connect to a corporate's website, that there's a certificate there that is secure, or for communication between different infrastructure internally. So there's already kind of that, in my mind, is almost the one area of this whole space that is kind of well understood already by corporates. It's just that how it's being used is slightly different in that regard.
Yeah, maybe to build on that, I'm fascinated to sort of hear what are potentially some of the challenges you think that organizations face in this regard, specifically when thinking about Web3. I know you do a lot of consulting in the space, so it'd be fascinating to hear some of the repeating themes in your conversations.
Yes, so I think the main one that comes up most of all is the user experience part of it, in terms of people. What continues to surprise me about Web3 is the level of knowledge, well, the variation in the level of knowledge that customers have when you speak to them. Because often sometimes you'll speak to someone who hasn't even heard the expression Web3, or maybe they've heard the expression Bitcoin, and the first thing their mind goes to is, oh, it uses lots of power, and how's that helpful for our organization? All the way through to people who are asking you questions like, what do you think of this layer 2 scaling solution on Ethereum? So it's like there's this huge breadth of knowledge, which is driven, I think, by the fact that ultimately it's been cryptocurrencies' influence on the mainstream and NFTs, because they're kind of the two parts of Web3 that have already crossed the chasm and gone mainstream in terms of, what's happening right now is, we'll see what happens, but the broader narrative there is that there's been a lot of interest in those technologies, and because of that sort of mainstream interest in these technologies, you've got people who've actually spent a lot of time trying to understand them, because maybe they bought some ether and then they were using Coinbase, and then they saw, oh, there's this other token. What is this other token, this thing called Matic? And maybe do I want to invest in some of that? And so that kind of got them reading a little bit more around the subject. And so as a result of this, That's what I think is most surprising for us, is how much people sometimes know. But then, more practically tying it down, I think a big thing is still the user experience piece that comes up again and again, especially when we're talking about the wallet technologies, in that if you're a Web3 native working with MetaMask, there's a certain understanding you need to have there. You need to be familiar with concepts like an Ethereum address that's written in hexadecimal. You might have a transaction that comes to you that you need to sign, and then there's the key management piece as well, which Johann touched on earlier. And so when we're speaking to corporates, often the first thing that they come up with is around the usability piece, because they're thinking, well, how are we going to get these people who can barely use this internal application we've worked with to work with something like MetaMask? And that's kind of where their mind goes to. And no doubt it's something that's comes up on your side, Johann, and I think it would be a great point for you to jump into some more on, and what MetaMask's doing there.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think generally what we're seeing is the adoption cycles of Web3 has been directly correlated and caused by regulatory oversight for organizations. And so the 1,000 true fans, the early adopters, have very much been capital allocators into the space. And so by that, I mean, your typical crypto fund allocating into DeFi. And so what we've seen over the last year or so is a crossing of the chasm of Web3. And definitely our conversations and our data, and I think that just the market sentiment and structure changing in sort of moving from the crypto native institutions, so your crypto funds, to more traditional organizations over time. And then the thing that we've seen is that has definitely also driven how the prioritization around custody tech has generally evolved, as well as custody generally, or key management, if we want to phrase it that way. What you tend to find is that, as you point out, you have your crypto native user. Let's assume this is a DAO or a crypto fund, deeply familiar with MetaMask, have been power users for many years. And as they're sort of scaling their organization, they're very much thinking around, okay, what sort of infrastructure do we need to manage our wallets? How can we have either multi-sig, or again, this phrasing that I used earlier, M-event signing, so we have multiple individuals signing transactions. And I'd say that the core fundamental principle there is risk management. How can they embed risk management within their firms? And this is why you've seen a very particular part of custody infrastructure be very popular amongst these early adopters. And maybe a sort of a very simple mental model to take away is that there tends to be sort of three broad categories in terms of custody infrastructure or custody tech or licensed custodian. And so the first bucket kind of falls into infrastructure, and this is MPC and HSM, and we can dig more into that as we explore this discussion. And then the second bucket is licensed custodians, and these are entities that have gone through a formal regulatory approval process to become qualified or licensed organizations that custody assets on your behalf. And then what we've seen sort of how the market structure has changed is that it's very much the infrastructure, the MPC or HSM technology that's been super popular amongst sort of the early adopters, because it allows for fast signing and cost-effective signing of transactions. And then over time, as the market has matured over the last year, we've seen obviously larger organizations step into the space. Traditional organizations, they're very interested in NFTs. And therefore, their needs around custody infrastructure has also changed dramatically. And a really interesting mental model to hold here is that, for example, in the US, if you have more than $150 million in AUM, you have to work with a licensed custodian. So again, that regulatory piece, plays a giant role. So I think this has been a fascinating trend to observe in terms of the maturity of the market, the adoption cycle generally with Web3, and therefore that driving how different organizations think broadly about, again, what infrastructure they need, how they're thinking about signing, and the risk management around their processes. And maybe the last thing I'll say is, I was smiling when you talked about UX earlier. I do think this is something as builders in the space, we're all thinking very deeply about. I think within MetaMask, there's obviously such a such a strong adoption within crypto native institutions as well as crypto native retail users. And I think for a lot of product builders in the space, we're thinking very deeply about how do we bring, the next wave of institutional adoption or retail adoption into the space.
And I think that that'll definitely be a good thing to talk about a little bit more later as well, in terms of the next wave of user onboarding. And so just to kind of unpack what you were talking about there with respect to, firstly, the infrastructure providers and the MPC and HSM type approaches. And so I guess in the earlier days anyway, with respect to Web3, the kind of the approach we've taken with a lot of platforms, and it's still the case as well, is this, I guess, what we call Web 2.5, where you have a more traditional platform, and a centralized crypto exchange is a great example of this, and then they provide a kind of gateway to Web3, and then they might have some HSM or MPC type infrastructure which they're using to secure the actual keys there, and then they have in effect accounts, like more traditional accounts that are mapped to those keys, and they provide all of that. And that's kind of I guess the entry level approach to doing something in not a decentralized way, but in a way that provides people with a degree of onboarding there. And so is that something that you're seeing starting to evolve on the infrastructure side, or is that kind of how that part remains, but then the approach being taken by, say, some of the other folk that you mentioned, like in the custody infrastructure, if it's changing there?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a segmentation to make around the consumer retail market versus sort of the organizational market generally. And so the general mapping that you've phrased, I think, is absolutely accurate around the consumer space generally. You're definitely seeing custodial wallets play an entry point for consumers generally, as maybe a simple way to get started in crypto. And that might be to acquire an asset, whether that's a token or NFT. And then as you phrased earlier at the start of the conversation, they might hear of another token that then sets them on this wonderful journey of going down the route of thinking about decentralization and becoming non-custodial. And I think those principles still hold true. It's definitely a journey that we experience and see, within ConsenSys. That's definitely one segment of the market. And then I think the other segment of the market that I was sort of referencing earlier, and talking through the different mental models we hold, is very much the organizational or the institutional adoption of Web3. And that, as I pointed out, is again, very driven by regulatory oversight. It's very driven by the technical nous and the understanding of not just blockchains and crypto and Web3, but also, to your point, the infrastructure that is then potentially needed in order to run your organization. And for smaller organizations like crypto funds, they need infrastructure that allows them to not have to host potentially infrastructure on their sites. It makes far more sense to have a wallet as a service infrastructure or software that they can use to provide them with, again, multiple signing processes, allow listing of smart contract calls, allow listing of dApp URLs. And then as the market evolves and matures and you sort of move towards sort of larger organizations, again, they tend to gravitate almost back towards, that centralized entity, working with licensed custodians or qualified custodians that take the responsibility on their behalf to store their assets, to store their keys, and then often signing on their behalf when it comes to transactions. And again, that is very much driven by the freedom and regulatory side these sort of user segments or user groups have. Within both those groups, so whether we're talking about custody infrastructure or then licensed custodians, one can make sort of further segmentation between what is considered to be cold wallets, warm wallets, and hot wallets. And that then coalesces around how the keys are stored, how long does the signing process take, and then essentially sort of how close to the internet or hot those wallets are in terms of their capabilities to sign transactions. And obviously, as cold wallets denote, you're looking at keys being stored on infrastructure that is secure. It doesn't touch the internet. We can go down a very deep conversation of how that is done and how cold wallet infrastructure has a range of patents to make sure that you don't have malicious actors interacting with the cold wallet infrastructure. So I think that's sort of a general mapping of the landscape. It also sort of indicates how different organizations have different needs. And that will be very much driven by, again, the size of the organization, what their ultimate end use case is. Is it, to run a trade strategy as a crypto fund? Is it to acquire NFTs as a, luxury brand? All these sorts of things will then tend to coalesce around a particular type of custody infrastructure or licensed custodian.
And I think that kind of leads into some of the questions as well that have come up here. And the one that kind of jumps out is that this idea, and we will cover the other questions too, but this idea of using different accounts and the almost the delineation of responsibility between multiple accounts and breaking it up based on what the requirements are of the business there. And so someone specifically was asking about, are there best practices there, or I'd guess that the answer is probably going to be it depends on the specific use case, with all of this stuff. But are there some points you could talk to on that?
Yeah, so it's such a sort of important question, because I think it again references the need of organizations versus the consumer market. And so when you're talking about an organization, you are obviously thinking about potentially multiple different wallets. You might have an organization that has different departments. Within those departments, you might have different desks. Within those desks, you might have different wallets. And then within those different wallets or accounts, you might have different rule settings. Perhaps a certain individual organization is allowed to interact with certain smart contracts or, do certain transfers of a certain size. So that governance layer, that infrastructure layer, that organizational setup layer is exactly what custodians and as well as custody infrastructure players provide. Now, it's hard again to answer the question in terms of what is considered the gold standard and what is best practices. It's really going to be driven again by the unique circumstances of the organization. Obviously, what's very important to sort of think through is what capabilities does your custodian or your custody tech provider give you in terms of setting up, the complexity around the organization, the number of wallets, and then the rules for things beyond that. Something that we see that is very profound and paramount to how organizations are thinking about kind of access to Web3 generally, as well as key management generally, is to make sure that the provider they're working with has a very strong governance layer. And I phrase this governance layer, perhaps sort of maybe just to unpack what I mean by that, is the capability to have different rule settings around what different individuals and wallets can do. And we definitely see that that is sort of, one of those sort of key defining filter criteria that institutions then use to decide which custody tech or qualified custodian to work with. That then normally drives not just how signing or approval happens, but then also very importantly, again, what different accounts have the power to do within the organization. So I'm hoping that gives you sort of a general steer and sort of how to think about this. We definitely don't see aspects of one shoe fits all. And because we take a very custodian agnostic approach within MetaMask Institutional, and we work with different institutions, different custodians globally, we've definitely seen a whole range of different practices being implemented, depending on the organization. Hopefully that's clear. If the audience member wanted some examples of how, for example, a crypto fund might be thinking of it versus, a luxury brand, I can maybe give some practical examples, but it normally coalesces around very similar things. How many people are signing the transaction? What power do those individuals have to sign transactions? And how do we then bake in different rule settings to make sure that we're interacting with the right smart contracts the right addresses, and then very importantly, making sure that we have, obviously backups in place. For example, if the organization structure had to change, if different members of the organization had to come in and out, how can we then change those rules in a very effective fashion?
So from the point of view of the end users of these different accounts, is there still an experience where they have what is something that's more akin to the traditional MetaMask experience, but it's for a corporate application there? Or is it something that's it's fun and it's kind of just plumbed into these custody providers, or are there some fundamental differences beyond that?
Yeah, so let me talk about what we do, because it'll be helpful just to frame the conversation. So for folks in the audience that are familiar with using MetaMask with a ledger, so this is a hardware wallet. What that gives you is the capability to connect to all 17,000 exponentially increasing DeFi protocols across the ecosystem, as well as connect to and transact and move assets across any EVM network. And then the typical user journey there is that as a user, I can use my MetaMask wallet to connect to all of Web3. I can initiate a transaction, I can confirm a transaction, but then I come back to my ledger hardware wallet to sign the transaction. So there's sort of a separation between church and state. On one side, where does connectivity happen? Where does initiation happen? Where does confirmation happen? And the other side, where are my keys stored and where am I signing transactions? And so with MetaMask Institutional, I would say take that exact same mental model, take that exact same user journey, but in this instance, replace your hardware wallet with a custodian or a custody infrastructure provider. So what you essentially have is connectivity and access to all of Web3, all EVMs, all DeFi protocols, all NFT marketplaces, connectivity, confirmation, initiation, but then we deep link you into your custodian UI to go through that multiple signing approval process. And this is where, again, ideally, we're giving organizations the best of both worlds. Unrivaled access, but also very importantly, key management, key signing, that rule setting that I referenced earlier, baked into their custodian or their custody infrastructure partner that they're working with to go through that signing process. And this is where obviously multiple individuals can then sign into that UI and then sign or approve a transaction, where that transaction is then broadcast to mainnet to be mined. So that's sort of a typical user journey and flow. Now, we definitely see instances where organizations potentially need white label solutions in terms of the custody infrastructure that they use, or they're using the custody infrastructure in different ways, perhaps a bit more basic. They don't want to access all of Web3. It's more just for the storing of assets. And that obviously is very much a conversation with the custodian or the custody tech provider in terms of the capabilities that they provide. And maybe sort of to link your question, I'm sort of very curious in terms of, some of the areas that you're seeing in the conversations you're having, specifically around sort of private key management. I'm curious sort of in any of the points that I've referenced earlier, do you see similar themes? Are you seeing custody key management being done in a different way in terms of the organizations you're speaking with?
So I think from our side with the conversations we're having there, they're coming at it less from we need to access the protocols in Web3. They're thinking more about, how can we find, here's an example, we have this specific type of business asset or thing that we maintain within our business. We want to tokenize it because we think a tokenized representation would be much more powerful. We could put that onto a public network and kind of manage it there, but how would those pieces fit together? And so whilst I think if we're in that sort of production place where they're wanting to do the kind of full custody piece, that's that comes into it. More of the conversations we have are people who are kind of earlier along. We're trying to get them onto Web3, and so sometimes we find that there's more of a this traditional approach where they're using HSM infrastructure rather than a custody provider because there's there's not kind of the same amount at stake, from their perspective, because they're working with more of a ring fence type application, and so they're on our side we're not tending to have the sort of custody infrastructure type discussions. That being said, I'm interested in in terms of hearing more about what you've discussed there. So the relationship with these sorts of institutional clients, when they are kind of more heavily embracing the Web3 infrastructure, the custodian relationship, I presume, becomes quite key, because their staff are then having to use the custodian to manage the access to, in effect, the access to Web3 via it, and set whatever limits and all these other parameters that you mentioned there.
Yeah, so we tend to see almost a very similar repeating pattern, regardless of the size of the organization, in terms of thinking through how do I gain access to Web3, and what are some of the things I need to be thinking about to solve for the various different flows or the transaction flow process. And that normally starts with access. How can I use a wallet? How can I use an institutional wallet, and what institutional wallets are in the market today? And then following that, very much the opposite side of the same coin, and goes hand in hand with that wallet question, which is, how do I think about custody? And we definitely think that in terms of the typical transaction flow process that organizations go through, that custody layer becomes, as you point out, quite paramount in their decision making. And I stepped through some mentor models earlier, but some of the things we sort of talk a lot with organizations about is, okay, how frequently are they signing transactions? What might be their trade strategy or their sort of focus around, acquiring NFTs as another example. Do they need to work with a licensed custodian, or can they use custody infrastructure? What insurance might they need to have in place? Do they think about hot versus warm versus cold wallets? All these different sort of frameworks or checkboxes tend to then coalesce their decision-making around a particular type of player, whether it's a licensed custodian or a custody tech provider. Following that, then it comes down into what rule setting can we put in place, as you referenced earlier. And I think that becomes really paramount as well, in terms of making sure that that risk layer, that governance layer, as I mentioned earlier, is in place. And those are the sort of, the typical framework that most institutions use in thinking about which custodian partner do I work with. Now, what we see is that on average, and again, this very much depends on the organization, once the number of transactions per month go above roughly 100, you tend to see a gravitation towards MPC technology over HSM or contract wallets, where transactions are signed on chain with contract wallets or HSM infrastructure. That's not always the case. Sometimes HSM also gets lumped into that MPC bucket when transactions are more than 100. But the focus then is normally with an organization that needs to sign very quickly. It needs to sign frequently. It needs to have a very streamlined process in terms of thinking about not just access to Web3, but also, again, the key management, key signing process. And the persona that it's helpful to be thinking about here is typically being crypto funds, hedge funds, trading desks, market makers, DAOs in terms of treasury management. These are the typical personas that tend to gravitate towards infrastructure that allows for fast signing and cost-effective signing. For other organizations that potentially have, buy and hold NFT strategy, or maybe trade the primary trended markets, so more sort of a buy and hold allocation to Web3 more longer term, there will be other considerations, and they can gravitate towards more sort of key signing processes that may be a little more cost, hiring costs and potentially a contract wallet, for example, but then comes with other benefits, given the way they're thinking about accessing Web3. So they might be higher insurance, for example. They might be higher, more defined governance rules, etc. So again, it's also this constant thinking through these various different frameworks and characteristics that then helps drive how organizations then gravitate to which partner to work with. And then lastly, the thing to say, and something that I touched on, very early on, which is insurance. I think this is becoming more top of mind. On-chain insurance is a very tricky topic, becomes very expensive very quickly. And what you tend to find is that custodians and custody tech providers provide insurance in terms of their cold wallet infrastructure, but then there's often less in terms of on-chain, wallets or on-chain infrastructure. And that is also a very big decision-making process that organizations need to go through in terms of making sure that they have the right insurance in place. And this often entails working with the insurance provider outside of the remit of the what they get with the custodian. So they often might work privately with a insurance provider to help them assess the risk of their processes, assess the risk of when assets are in flight, what assets are insured today, and then off the back of that, sort of work out what bespoke insurance might look like. And given how fast Web3 is moving, I think the insurance market is still very much developing its frameworks of how to think about risk and how to make sure that the costs in terms of insuring hot wallets is not exorbitant. So things that you pointed out earlier, Conor, we're still very early in the space generally. And I think a lot of the infrastructure is still very much being developed for institutions to bridge into the space.
Just touching a little bit more then on the MPC wallets and how they fit into it, because I think it's helpful just to provide a little bit of a primer just on the differences with those.
Absolutely. So I'm going to make this super simple because one gets very complex in terms of the maths behind sharing and all the various different types of types of MPCs, etc. So MPC is multi-party computation. The very simple sort of framework to think or mental model to hold is that when a wallet gets created, you have several different key shares being created at the same time. And therefore, all these key shares need to sign independently. There's no single point of failure. So there's no single key that if that single key is lost or stolen or compromised, then obviously that wallet is compromised. With MPC, you have these multiple key shares that sign independently. And this is why you can set up what is called an M of N signing process. So in my very simple crypto fund example earlier, if you and I had to be part of a crypto fund and we had 2 key shares, and we could then potentially put a rule in place where both of us need to sign transactions. And therefore, if my key share was compromised, the wallet wouldn't be compromised because we still have our 2 of 2 signing process. And obviously we would have a backup key in case of these instances, or a backup key share. What you tend to find with HSMs, so hardware security modules, more sort of a typical old school way of how crypto generally has been approached in the past, is where you have a wallet that gets created, you have a key that gets created for that wallet, and then that key is stored in infrastructure that again is meant to be secure, often doesn't touch the internet or is protected, sits on a particular hardware security module, as it's noted. And again, these types of different infrastructure very much will depend on some of the frameworks that I referenced earlier of how organizations should be thinking about access to decide which of the 2 options will suit their needs.
I think already with everything that's being discussed, I don't know if something already exists like this, but does MetaMask Institutional have like a white paper on a lot of these best practices that you've outlined here?
Yeah, so we often get asked like, who's our favorite custodian, who should folks work with? And it's a bit like asking, who's your favorite child? Almost impossible to answer. We very much take an agnostic approach. We work with 7 partners today, covering players in Asia, or the APAC region, and North America, Europe, Israel, etc. Again, in all these different types of hot, cold, MPC, HSM, and licensed custodian. And so we have some frameworks that we help folks think through, but we never go through a process of advising on which custodian to sort of allocate to. It's very important that organizations spend a bit of time understanding the custodian that they're working with. And you referenced the white paper there. And I think that's fundamental. It's really important that an organization thinks very deeply about how the key is being stored, the insurance that's in place, how a backup key is being stored, the history of the organization. Are they SOC 2 compliant? There are a range of questions that's very important for organizations to ask. And I think we're very much still in a phase of the market where we're seeing crypto native organizations that understand most of these things that I'm talking about very deeply. But as we're seeing kind of the crossing the chasm, I think that education piece is very important. And that's definitely something that we try and do our best at providing some of these frameworks.
Yeah, I think even just the frameworks you've been outlining here, it's something that so many people would benefit from, just having a high-level overview of them. I'm going to run through all the questions here just to make sure we've covered them. I've got some other things that I'm hoping we'll be able to get onto, but we'll just to make sure that everyone's answered. So one of them was, what's the best practice to mentor traditional organizations' accounting departments? And so they give an example here, which is, say, Amnesty International wants to do fundraising via an NFT, but they need a creator address that must be an Amnesty one, and they need to account crypto revenues from the NFT sales. And so I guess how do you link accounting departments in traditional organizations and educate them on how they can go about working with Web3?
Gosh, I'm almost, I think you're almost the perfect person to ask that question. So I might kick it back to you. I will, yeah, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah, I'm sure you were going to jump, point out on it's the education piece. I mean, ultimately, if these organizations want to find a way to do this stuff, they'll be able to, but they will encounter challenges along the way. I mean, even say with my organization, we get paid by some clients in crypto. Our accounting software doesn't support crypto assets in any shape or form. So you need to find ways to, in effect, new platforms and services to do this. And so I think really more than anything, it's about, yes, there's an education piece, but also the business needs to have a willingness to take on all of the learnings associated with getting something like this over the line, because they can, most businesses can find a way to do this in a way that's not going to get them in hot water. I mean, I guess it can be slightly more sensitive in the US market, but certainly, more broadly, there are ways of doing it, but they need to do their diligence and be prepared that it's going to be a lot bumpier than most new initiatives they do.
Yeah, we've definitely seen in traditional organizations, this process can take quite a while, and the organization generally going through potentially multiple rounds of doing due diligence on partners. Normally, there's obviously a due diligence questionnaire that a custodian needs to answer or provide data around. And then to Conor's point, it's very much a point of education. And I think that responsibility will no doubt lie on the custodian to make sure that they're communicating effectively and clearly in terms of what value are they providing, how do they solve the needs of the organization, and in terms of the example of Amnesty International, how might they provide a solution, given this very unique kind of use case. So very happy if folks want to reach out to me to make sure that either our sales team or we can obviously facilitate introductions to the partners we work with. So please do grab my details afterwards, and very happy to steer you in the right direction.
There's been some other discussions, I think, around some of the user experience challenges, which I think we'll park for now, because I think it'll be good to come back to the user experience, because that is something that I've got on my list here. And so we will, yeah. So another question, how can different wallets embed in governance frameworks? So they're best practices already for them.
Yeah, I might ask Alessandro to maybe sort of help clarify the question a bit more. Normally what happens, and I'm hoping I'll answer your question, but please correct me if I'm not, one sets up the organization first, and that organization might have multiple different departments, and then those departments or funds often will then have multiple different wallets. And then you can set up this governance layer depending on, again, the capabilities of the custodian. And that could that governance layer could be across the organization. You can have then potentially rule setting at a particular wallet level or at a fund level. again, like it very much depends on the capabilities of the custodian in terms of allowing you a range of governance layer that then spans different funds, different wallets, different accounts, and then for different funds to inherit the rule setting. Often we find that it starts very simple in terms of the governance layer. It normally coalesces around what are the DApp URLs that my individuals on my firm can interact with? What are the smart contract calls that they are allowed to do? What tokens as a custodian are we happy to deal with, or as an organization, shall I say? These are some of the fundamental things that we hear and see often. And then also very importantly, how can we allow a whitelist particular addresses? So we make sure when we're doing a transfer from one asset to another, from one address to another, that we're always interacting with the right address. And then the second tier of sort of risk frameworks that we see is around the number of transactions, the size of transactions, which then, given the combination of these tier 1 and tier 2 governance layers, one can build quite complex rule settings in terms of what a wallet can do, when and how. And then obviously that then is built into the infrastructure or the operational processes of an organization. So I'm hoping that answers your question, but feel free to drop another one if I've missed it.
And kind of expanding a little bit on this, the next question is saying, if you're using a hardware wallet or custodians to make it more secure to sign transactions, is there anything that could make things more operationally automated, i.e. if there's a way for an enterprise to permit transactions on a recurring basis without a signer presence?
Yes, so fantastic question. Often you will find that custodians do have a UI that members of organization need to log into. So let's assume the executive team all need to log into to sign transactions. But absolutely, there are providers that then can provide those same rule setting and signing process in a programmatic fashion. And so the payload gets generated by MetaMask Institutional. It is then sent to a client or a server in this instance that then will sign those transactions programmatically. And that rule setting has then been set in place by an organization to make sure only certain transactions are allowed or signed then based on the rule framework that has been set. So this absolutely exists. They're often the custody tech providers, the infrastructure players that provide kind of complex rule setting and allowing you to spin up a server that then signs on your behalf. So a user doesn't have to log into a UI and sign transactions. And maybe that to end with the answer to this question, it's definitely a trend we're seeing become very popular within institutional trading firms and making sure that they can run very complex trading strategies. Not just building those trading strategies in Python, for example, but then making sure they have programmatic signing of the trading strategies, because it doesn't help that they have these fast execution frameworks that they're running, but they need to log into UIs. So absolutely possible. And again, it comes down to the capabilities of the custodian partner that you're working with.
And I think that this kind of ties in with one of the other questions here as well, which is just someone asking if it's okay to split a hardware token and PIN between different people and require them to come together to sign a transaction as a procedure. I mean, this is really what the custodians do for people. They provide this as a service, right? So I think with what you've said thus far, it kind of reinforces that yes, there's the manual way, which is like everyone's got their own copy of the, whether it's keys or something that they need to physically come together to do. But it's you want to use a custodian because they're really simplifying that process and providing the automation to for you.
Yeah, and I suppose it comes back again to different users have different needs. I might have very strong values around decentralization and preferring to be non-custodial. And so, I take responsibility for storing my private keys. And so again, it's not one solution fits all. I think it's more a question of when you're an organization that tends to naturally gravitate you towards working with custody tech or working with a qualified custodian, because as we pointed out earlier, you almost have to. it focuses around how many individuals need to sign a transaction, and also potentially regulation that you face. Now, if it was Conor and I running a crypto fund, and he had some seed phrase and I had some seed phrase, I'm sure we'd be happy to meet in North London somewhere and put them together and then trade for a while. But I think as the organization grows, that process probably won't scale very well.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the context of, as you say, traditional business, I mean, banks, they provide custody services, and they always have done. And so the crypto custody is kind of no different from the perspective of an institution anyway, when they've got providers that they work with in that regard that are regulated and so on. So there were a few things just on the chat around UX challenges that some people had recently, but I think the general message that they're talking about is that they feel like, in say user as well as merchant UX, which is probably maybe not the merchant side. I don't know if that comes so much into the remit of MetaMask Institutional, but I think more generally, it's still acknowledged that there are challenges of where we want to get to with respect to UX more broadly. Certainly, how I've been thinking about it more recently is, I like to call it the sort of AOL moments of many wallet providers, where there's challenges and barriers to entry for people who want to work with native Web3 products and services. And I think that with initiatives being taken by different wallet providers, it's almost this idea of the wallet itself becomes like a jump-off platform for some of these potential more trusted services, and kind of analogous to back in the day, you'd say have AOL or CompuServe or one of these ISPs provide people's access to the internet, where they'd be able to use email, they'd have chat rooms, they'd have a limited kind of experience there, just to simplify the user experience. And I kind of feel like that's where we're headed nearer term with some of Web3, just to onboard that kind of next generation of users, people who won't have the patience in order to actually access that. So that's my thought process, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well, because I think it talks to some of the challenges around UX as well more broadly.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic, and it's a very important point. And I think as product builders in the space, it's fundamental that we think very deeply about how do we keep our users secure, how do we keep our users safe, and how do we empower them in a way that they understand what they're doing, while thinking very deeply about user experience. As a builder in the space, I think that we need to think much deeper about design and user experience within Web3 generally. It's a very technical environment. It's very complex to understand, how to create a wallet, how to store seed phrases. It's very complex to bridge, for example, from one layer one to another. The whole space is filled with a lot of technical jargon, and there's a huge blocker in terms of adoption. It requires a lot of investment of time and energy. And so, I'm not highlighting anything here that the audience does not already know. I think it's very important that we think very deeply about kind of as product builders or as product teams, what are our product principles and what are our design principles? As we sort of building experiences within wallets, or even dApps, or whatever the experience might be within Web3 generally. I completely agree with you. I think there's a lot of things around thinking about the user onboarding experience and the process and friction of what it takes to buy an NFT for the first time. You might be on OpenSea, you might have a range of wallets that you can then choose from, and as a user, how on earth do you choose which one to decide to adopt? Then having to potentially go to a Chrome store and downloading a plugin or a Web3 wallet, and then going through a process of obviously downloading the seed phrase or importing the seed phrase. Now, for Web3 or crypto natives like myself, or for many individuals on this call, this seems like second nature, and we're deeply comfortable doing so, and we prefer to do so. It's a feature, not a bug. But as we think about the next 100 million users, I think it's really important that we think from first principles, right? How can we potentially simplify some of the onboarding experiences? And potentially, how could a wallet evolve as the user becomes more comfortable with taking on more responsibility? I think these are some of the really important questions that the industry generally is asking. And I think about, the aspect of keeping users safe generally, whether it's retail users or institutional users. How can we make sure that a user understands what they're signing? And the MetaMask team have done some great work on this front and continue to do some great work. They rolled out a feature around decoding transaction parameters, and I know they're doing a lot of work to evolve this over time. And we within MetaMask Institutional have built a range of capabilities to make sure that our users are given a range of risk assessments to understand what is it they're interacting with. What is the risk of the contract that you might be calling? Might it be a nefarious counterparty that is flagged for sanctions, for example? Are they interacting with the correct compound DApp URL? Are they doing the correct call? I think there's a smart contract call. There's so many things in this space that I think we need to think very deeply about to abstract that complexity. And I think if we think about sort of mainstream adoption, this will only happen when we start abstracting this complexity. I suspect similar to your AOL analogy, I don't think a lot of people can explain from first principles how the internet works. It just does for most of us. And as I think about Web3, we have a lot of responsibility, I think, to make sure we can abstract the complexities in the same way that it just works for the user. So I know that was a sort of long diatribe, but I feel deeply, deeply passionate about UX and Web3 generally, and us as product builders thinking very thoughtfully about the experience we want to build for our users and making sure we keep them safe, we keep them secure, and we're not making them think.
Yeah, and it's certainly something that, whilst it's kind of a known challenge with Web3 around the usability side of it, it's something that is so widely embraced by the community. No one's saying like what we have now is good enough. It's widely recognized that we can do better, but it takes time. It's hard, when you to build this stuff, and we are still early in the evolution. So there's another more specific question here, which has just come up, and this is about if you've seen any enterprises using one of M multi-sig configurations to effectively delegate the ability for various employees to execute maybe petty cash types of transactions. I'd guess this kind of ties in with the custodian type thing, in that custodians could no doubt enable this sort of these sorts of things. But have you seen this kind of petty cash spending with crypto?
Not necessarily this particular use case. Maybe just to reference what I said earlier, absolutely doable. Maybe the example that I'm going to use, and it's not something that I've talked deeply about, is that we work very closely with Gnosis Safe, which is a digital asset management platform. It's on-chain, it's a smart contract wallet, provides multi-sig, and they work very closely with many, if not most, DAOs in the space. And so your question almost makes me think of decentralized autonomous organizations, because this is a very typical use case that they're thinking very deeply about. How can we make sure that the contributors of a DAO have say in potentially providing signatures on a range of different topics, including petty cash for employees. So this is absolutely use cases we're seeing, and again, it just depends on the organization that the individual asking the question is part of, Andrew, and what might be their needs be in terms of, is it a contract wallet, is it on-chain, is it a non-custodial solution, is it a custodial solution, and then also the capabilities of those different players.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we have, I guess, 2 minutes left. There are a number of different topics on my list here that we could have touched on, and certainly things like where we are with respect to regulation and so on here, but I don't think we're going to cover it in a minute. I think what would be very helpful, though, is just to kind of reaffirm the mental models very quickly that you've spoken about today, Johann, especially around the things like the types of custodians, the things that people need to think about, just so they take that home with them after this webinar, to ensure that it's really drilled it into them.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Conor. I was just laughing because I don't think anyone can summarize regulation in Web3 in a minute. I challenge anyone to do so. So maybe sort of very simple sort of mental model to take away is that there are generally sort of three broad categories that exist in terms of thinking about organizational wallets and custody generally. You first have MPC, so multi-party computation. Multiple different key shares are generated when a wallet gets created. These multiple different key shares all need to sign. HSM, hardware security module. This is more a single key gets generated, and this is stored on a secure device. And these two first categories are normally bucketed under what is called custody infrastructure or custody tech. And then the third bucket is normally HSM infrastructure, but it also has on top of that stamped with what is called a licensed or qualified custodian. And this is when an entity stores keys on your behalf and they've gone through a formal approval process by a regulator to become a qualified custodian. So there's sort of these three broad categories. And institutions tend to gravitate to these three broad categories, depending again on the number of transactions they have per month, the governance layer that they have, that they require the custodian partners to provide to them, the insurance, the regulatory framework that they might have. These different frameworks will then help drive which of these three partners or which of these three custodians or custody tech providers they tend to gravitate towards.
Well, that was an awesome, succinct summary. So just with, I guess, to wrapping up, we'll say thank you to everyone for their time. If people want to reach out to either of us after this call, I'm sure if they have specific questions, Johann, you'll be the person for that. But certainly you can find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and reach out to me that way. Johann, how about yourself if people want to contact you?
Yeah, please do feel free to reach out. Do find me on LinkedIn. I think that's probably best. Also, I'm on Twitter as well. I'm Johann Bornman on Twitter. If you see a blue fox, it'll be me. And so please feel free to connect.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, it's been great to actually chat, and yeah, I hope everyone had as many takeaways as I did on this. Oh.
Thank you very much, Conor. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Conor and Johann, for joining us today and leading a great conversation. Please feel free to place your social media handles in the chat so all attendees can follow your work. For additional information about joining the EEA, please reach out to membership at eea-eth-alliance.org or visit our website, and that's been pasted in the chat for you. You can also follow the EEA on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you again, and this concludes today's EEA Education Series webinar. All right, bye everyone.